Dry hopping is the process of adding hops to the fermenter to enhance a beer's aroma without adding bitterness. But when should the hops be added? At yeast pitch, at high kräusen, or after fermentation? Well, conventional wisdom favors after fermentation, but some brewers report benefits from the biotransformation that occurs when adding dry hops earlier in the process. We've conducted 3 experiments and 54 triangle tests to compare these methods. When should dry hops be added to beer? Let's find out. This episode is sponsored by More Beer. More on them in a bit. How's it going? My name's Martin Keane. Let's talk dry hop. Now, dry hopping is a technique that's said to have originated in good old Blighty, by which I mean Britain, as a means of beer preservation. Now, the idea being that prior to shipping full casks of beer overseas, brewers would load them up with hops. Why? Well, because hops preserve acids that have natural antibacterial and antifungal properties. Today, dry hopping is primarily used to add a pungent punch of character to beer, and the process is, well, it's pretty simple. With the beer in the fermenter, you just toss in a charge of hops. The beer is nowhere near warm enough for isomerization of alpha acids to occur, so the hops will contribute aromatic qualities without adding bitterness. So the question is, when during the fermentation process should the hops be added? Well, the first of 3 experiments was conducted by former Brülosophy contributor Greg Foster to evaluate the differences between a Hazy IPA dry hopped at the beginning of fermentation and the same beer dry hopped towards the end of fermentation. Now, conventionally, many brewers wait till fermentation is nearly done before adding the hops, but that does mean opening up the fermenter and potentially exposing the beer to oxygen to do that. And that can be especially bad for a Hazy IPA, which we've shown to be highly sensitive to oxygen exposure. So, what if we just toss the hops in at the same time that we add the yeast? Well, the argument against that is that adding the dry hops so early could result in lost hop character, where volatile compounds are basically blown off by the yeast as the CO2 leaves the fermentation vessel. Hop aromas floating away out of your airlock. Now, Greg designed a Hazy IPA recipe to test this out with a sizable dry hop addition of Centennial, Citra, Galaxy, and Simcoe. Greg started by building a starter of Yeast London Ale 3, then set about his brew day. After the hot side brewing was complete, Greg transferred his chilled wort to a pair of fermentation kegs, which he'd cleverly modified with stainless mesh hop blockers, covering the dip tubes to avoid any clogs from the dry hop additions. Pretty cool. Now, with the yeast added to both fermenters, Greg then introduced the variable, adding the dry hop charge to one of the batches. Now, the beers were placed in a fermentation chamber, and 4 days later, Greg noted fermentation had slowed to a crawl in both batches. That indicated it was time to add the dry hop charge to the other batch. He purged the headspace of both kegs with CO2 to try to minimize the impact of opening one of the fermenters to the air. Then when the beers were done, they were cold crashed and transferred to serving kegs. Now, there was a noticeable difference in appearance, with the beer dry hopped at yeast pitch considerably clearer than the standard dry hop batch. And remember, this is supposed to be a Hazy IPA. Now, Greg conducted a triangle test with 16 people at the Pacific Gravity Brewing Club. Each participant was served 1 sample of the beer dry hopped at yeast pitch and 2 samples of the standard dry hop beer in coloured cups where they couldn't see those visual differences. Then they were asked to identify the sample that was unique. Given the sample size, 11 tasters would have had to correctly identify the beer as being different in order to reach statistical significance. In the end, only 6 participants did, indicating the tasters could not reliably distinguish the beers. Greg could also not tell these beers apart. So there was a difference in appearance, but aroma and flavour-wise, the variable, it didn't make much of a difference. Now, we tested this same variable again, but this time for a bottle-conditioned beer and a different beer style. Brew Club member Ben Ganzamir conducted this one to evaluate the differences between a bottle-conditioned American Pale Ale, dry hopped towards the end of fermentation, and one dry hopped at yeast pitch. This Pale Ale used Cascade and Citra in the dry hop. Greg brewed 1 batch of the beer and split it between 2 1.5-gallon fermenters. The dry hop charge was added to one of the batches at yeast pitch, then 4 days later, when fermentation had slowed, the other batch received the dry hop addition. The beers were bottled with primary sugar solution added and then let to sit at room temperature for about 2 weeks before being presented to tasters. This experiment was during COVID, so Ben conducted the triangle test on himself. Out of the 10 semi-blinded tests, Ben needed to identify the odd beer out at least 7 times for statistical significance. Ultimately, he correctly picked the sample just 4 times, which is right in line with blind luck. Ben said the beers were identical to him, to the point that all of his triangle test attempts were just basically guesses. Both had the same fruity hop aroma with a nice stone fruit flavour and a pleasant bitterness. But what about adding the hops at high kräusen to take advantage of biotransformation? Well, before we get to that, a quick word on today's sponsor, More Beer. More Beer's slogan is absolutely everything for beer making, and it's easy to see why, given their selection of over 8,000 products, like the Brewbuilt X3 uniconical stainless steel fermenter, or the Comos series of kegerators that give you everything you need to get started with dispensing and serving your homebrew. And for quality fermentations, More Beer carries stellar science, yeast, and nutrients. More Beer offer free shipping on most orders over $59. Also be sure to check out their awesome YouTube channel featuring brewing tips, hijinks, and incredible giveaways. Check out everything More Beer has to offer at morebeer.com. Now, if you want to sound knowledgeable about dry hopping, you could do worse than nod sagely while speaking of the transformative properties of biotransformation. It's all about the terpenes, man. Which is to say, by adding hops during active fermentation, certain hop-derived compounds such as terpenes can be transformed by the yeast into different, often more aromatic compounds like thiols, esters, or other modified terpenes, which can lead to more aromas finding their way into your beer. Now, this technique is particularly popular with hazy IPAs, so that's the beer style Marshall shot addressed in an experiment to evaluate the differences between beers where the dry hops were added at either high kräusen, which we're saying is biotransformation, or at the end of fermentation, which we'll call standard. Now, here's the recipe with 2 dry hop charges, and Marshall elected to brew these beers separately with the standard dry hop batch brewed 2 days before the biotransformation batch. Now, he did this to allow both of the beers to be dry hopped and packaged at the same time. So there was some hot side stuff which we don't really care too much about for this experiment, but this picture shows the biotransformation batch at high kräusen, which was about 40 hours after yeast pitch, while the standard batch, which was brewed 2 days prior, appears close to being done fermenting. So that was when Marshall pitched the first dry hop charge into both batches. Now, when both beers had no visible signs of fermentation, the second dry hop charge was added and the beers were transferred to serving kegs. Here's the resulting beers, and the standard dry hop sample is noticeably darker and a touch clearer than the biotransformation beer. 2 weeks later, the biotransformation batch continued to retain more haze. So what about the triangle test? Well, a total of 28 people participated, receiving 1 sample of the biotransformation dry hop beer and 2 samples of the standard dry hop beer. 15 tasters would have had to correctly identify the biotransformation beer as being different in order to reach statistical significance. A total of 11 tasters did, a non-significant result. We don't normally collect preference data for non-significant results, but Marshall did anyway, and preference between the 2 beers was split more or less 50-50. Now, I do know from the comment section that not everybody is thrilled with these videos when all 3 experiments come back with a non-significant result. According to Brülosophy, basically nothing matters. So, well, look, I wasn't going to do this, but tell you what, here's a bonus experiment, and for fans of significant findings, well, no spoilers, but I think you're going to like this. So Jake Houlihan designed an experiment to evaluate the differences between an English IPA that was dry hopped and one that was keg hopped. Keg hopping means he tossed the dry hops directly into the keg and they sat there on the bottom of the keg for the entire time the beer was in that vessel. Now, that represents 2 differences with the usual dry hop approach. One is that the hops were added when the beer is at a cold serving temperature rather than fermentation temperature, which would be a bit warmer. And secondly, the hops are in contact with the beer for much longer, for basically as long as it takes to kick the keg. Some pretty significant differences, but hey, according to Brülosophy, basically nothing matters. This was the recipe for the English IPA. I'm looking at this longingly, I've got to say. Now, after 5 days of fermentation, 1 beer was dry hopped in the fermenter, then the beers were transferred to serving kegs and the other beer received the keg hop charge, and they both used an identical stainless mesh filter. Now, here's how the beers came out, with the dry hopped beer a touch clearer. This was another COVID protocol beer, meaning Jake conducted 10 semi-blind triangle tests on himself. He needed to identify the unique sample at least 7 times in order to reach statistical significance. In the end, he correctly identified the unique sample, come on, 9 times, 9, which means, that's right, a significant result. Jake said that the keg-hopped beer had a more pungent hop aroma and flavour, which would have been great in an American IPA, but he felt was kind of odd in this English version. He much preferred the dry hop batch. So we've seen the time you add dry hops to beer often does have an impact on beer clarity, but in most of our experiments, the effect on flavour and aroma were less pronounced. I'm usually an end of fermentation dry hop guy, but based on these results, I'm tempted to try adding my dry hop charges when I add the yeast. What about you? Let me know in the comments. Now, the other question is, how long should the dry hops sit in the beer? And to see the results of 3 experiments testing that, watch this video here.